Well, good morning, Derek.
Good morning.
It's good to be here. Good morning, everybody. As Kayla was saying, a group of our people are in Costa Rica. Ray, Ruben, and 16 other people from Bethel are seeing the work that's been done in Costa Rica over the past, 25, almost 30 years, and getting to experience that. They're in services this morning, right now, and have participated in different activities down there. And it's exciting that we're not only doing work here in Yukon and Oklahoma, but we're also able to impact people around the world and Central America, where we spent a lot of time there. So, Derek, tell us a little bit about your adventure here or your experience here at Bethel. How long have you been here?
We've been here for almost right at 2 years, I think. And so we, I know a lot of other stories in here. We came from a background of church hurt and found a place here at Bethel where we felt safe and that had the type of focus that we wanted our church to have, we want us to have individually.
Absolutely. We are newcomers too to Yukon, mission field for a long time in New Mexico, and we came and we felt too like it was a place of healing, place of restoration, of kind of getting back and falling back in love with who we need to be in love with, and that's Jesus. Love our church. In fact, Sherry and I talk about from week to week. We really look forward to Sundays and coming in here and just seeing people come and just to serve and just to love on each other and just be a family. And I don't know, Derek, if you were to describe Bethel maybe in one word, and I know sometimes it's hard, especially for a teacher, to just use one word. And but what would the word be?
I give a Sunday school answer, which is Jesus. And
too bad Ruben's not here.
It's not that we have Jesus-centeredness or gospel-centeredness all figured out, but as a community, I feel like that's our aspiration and that's our focus, and it makes one safe. It makes one grow in the ways that we should.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really what the Summer on the Mount, which goes over the Sermon on the Mount, that's what it's all about, is Jesus and getting back connected to what He planned and purposed us to do and what He created us to do. So excited about your preaching and sharing with us the Word. During the past few months, Derek, what have you noticed here at Bethel? I mean, you've been here 2 years, but it seems like it's kind of gone into hyperdrive, the last year or so.
Yeah. I mean, it's as Ray and Ruben have shared over the past few weeks, is that there's been just steady, incredible growth, and in multiple ways, but the fact that we're hardly fitting into 2 services now is an indicator that something's happening and it's not stopping.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Ray and I have talked about it. And he said, Dad, I don't know if. And by the way, Ray's my son, so he called me Dad. And so he said, Dad, I don't know if we want Bethel to grow anymore. And I said, well, what are you going to do? Put a no vacancy sign out there in the front and say, turn people away? And, growth comes from God. God gives the increase. So it is a problem, but it's also a tremendous blessing that God's using this, as the guys say, the church out by the cow pasture, and to be a place, a refuge, a place where people can come in and get engaged, which is pretty amazing. Yeah. We are trying to get more volunteers. That being said, Derek hinting at the growth thing. With more growth comes more opportunity to serve and more need for volunteers. We have a tremendous amount of people that are serving. Some of you served in the first service or here in the second service, but we want to get everybody engaged. I think the culture here at Bethel especially is not just to come and sit. I think everybody comes and we encourage people to serve. If you look out in our new foyer out there, there's a board up there it says engage. And there's 5 different things there that are mentioned. You connect, and by the way, we're going to have Bethel Connect next week. And I'm not sure, Kayla, I think, is going to find out maybe when that is. Or anyway, it's next week sometime. We'll give you more information. But if you're new here, we want to get you to get connected. And then to serve, and then also to bring, and to give, and to commit. Those are just 5 things. It's not really difficult. But we're trying to enlist more servants, more people serving, and we have QR codes around the building. Out there, you'll find these laying around. And if you're old like me, QR codes, this funny-looking thing. It looks like one of those things they used to hold up and say, "What do you see in that?" Do you see a butterfly? Do you see, and then they psychoanalyze you, And so I don't know what I see in there. I see kind of like Derek. No, so you just scan that. If you've got a smartphone, if you don't have a smartphone, find somebody with a smartphone, and you can scan that and get engaged. There's all kinds of places to serve. And Derek was telling, Derek was kicked out. We have people that greet in here, and I'm sure that somebody greeted you. But Derek got fired from being a greeter in the lobby. And how'd that work, Derek?
I don't know if it was a firing or not.
Repositioning, maybe.
A repositioning, yeah. I don't have a resting greeter face, and so if you have a lineup of people, that you want to approach, I'm probably not going to be the one that you're most drawn to. So they put me out in the parking lot.
Okay. There you go. So if you don't fit in where, you think you want to serve, we'll reposition you. No, but no, there's a place to serve everywhere. You may not be a teacher. Derek is an amazing teacher. Some of you have been here at Bethel U, and just an outstanding teacher. We have people that are greeters. We have people that know how to serve donuts and working with our children. Nursery with our teens, our tweens, and a lot of places to serve. So just jump in, and if you're not sure where you want to serve, just pick a place. It may not be the place that you actually land, but there's always a place to serve, and that's what I love about Bethel. There's a place for everybody, and being a part of the family and being part of what God's doing here, which is pretty exciting. We're looking for 60 new volunteers, and that's going to help us get ready for the fall. And I believe we're going to continue to grow. I mean, you look out. This is pretty full, Derek, and both services pretty full. And this is summer vacation. We have 18 people out in Costa Rica, and it's a good thing they're out. We have room for everybody else. But Derek's going to bring us the word today, and so I hope that you listen, open your heart, and get ready to jump into the Summer on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, and I think this message will be a huge blessing for your life, okay? Let's get started.
All right. Like you all know, we're in the Sermon on the Mount and have been for a few weeks, so we'll continue there. We'll say, I have my brother here, right? Raise your hand, Trevor. He loves that. But he's my little brother, but somebody that I've come to admire a lot in his walk with Jesus and his intentionality and letting his faith shape also his professional life and so forth. But I want to right now travel back through time. So Lancaster, Pennsylvania, some of y'all may remember this in 2006. You remember some of the images of the aftermath of a deranged man that entered into an Amish schoolhouse, took Amish schoolgirls hostage, and ultimately shot 10 and killed 5. During all of that, two of the little girls, sisters, ages 11 and 13, in order to hopefully buy time and save the lives of the other girls, requested that the hostage taker kill them first. After all of that, the response of that community was incredible. Within hours to days, they had sought out the killer's wife and children to comfort them, the killer's mother. They set up a fund where they raised what they could in order to help this mother and her children afterward. Rewind a little bit more to some of the most notable moments of the civil rights movement here in America. And you've seen the pictures of black young people sitting at counters where they were not allowed to sit. Racial slurs and insults being hurled at them, drinks being poured on them, and not a hint of retaliation. And outside of those venues, others being thrown over into the streets by fire hoses and attacked by dogs, and yet not responding in kind. Rewind a little bit more to World War II. In World War II, in the Pacific Theater, there were certain POW camps that held some Allied prisoners and Japanese POW labor camps that during the process of their imprisonment found Jesus anew, and some for the first time. At the end of that imprisonment, as the last of the wounded Japanese soldiers were being trucked through their areas, some of these emaciated POWs took what meager rations that they had to these Japanese wounded soldiers. At the objection of their Japanese captors, bound their wounds, smiled at them, and said kind things to them. Rewind a little bit more to the 1500s. Dirk Willems is an Anabaptist preacher imprisoned for his faith. He escapes one day across a frozen pond. He makes it across, but the pursuing guard does not. He falls in and he's drowning. Dirk is free until he turns back, makes his way across that frozen pond, and saves the drowning captor, only to immediately be re-imprisoned and then burned at the stake. Rewind a little bit further, a few thousand years, and find yourself in a garden with Peter and Jesus. Peter, in order to save his friend and his master, draws a sword, cuts off the ear of one of the hostile guards, only for Jesus to disarm him forever, heal that guard, and then a few days later go to the cross, forgiving those who nailed him there and dying for me, his enemy. What makes people do things like that? What on earth could compel them to do that? The short answer is discipleship. Discipleship here just meaning the forming of one's life into the image of Jesus. That's what brought them and compelled them to do those things. The book of Matthew is a book of discipleship. It's structured around panels of Jesus teaching and ends with Jesus saying, "Go into all the world and make disciples of all the nations." and teach them to obey all the things that I've commanded you. And by the time we reach the end of Matthew, we know what those things are. And the original readers and our mind should go directly to these chapters, the Sermon on the Mount, the manifesto of the new kingdom that Jesus has brought. What enables some people to surprising acts of love or non-retaliation toward enemies? It's that they were discipled in the way of Jesus. On the other hand, what compels us to despise our enemies and the other? We were discipled to do that. That's what happened. We've been discipled to follow the ways and respond as the world would respond. This was, and this is not a political sermon, but this was on full display just a few nights ago in a presidential debate where it was clear that those two candidates didn't just disagree with each other, they held each other in contempt, as is reflected and fostered among some of their followers on either side. We don't, as one writer says, have an anger problem in America. We have a contempt problem. And in short, we have a discipleship problem. We see it in our bumper stickers. We see it on what we vomit out on social media. We see it in how we talk about in the workplace those that we don't like in the workplace. We talk about it in terms of politics, in society, and all the issues that are brought up. Not only do we have our own enemies, like those that we know personally, but we also adopt immediately and without any question the enemies of our tribe. We adopt the enemies of our political tribe. We don't know the people on the other side, but since they are not our tribe, they're our enemies. We adopt the enemies of our nation. We've never met any of these other people around the world, but we immediately, without question, adopt the enemies of our nation. Wherever we stand on the LGBTQ plus spectrum, we adopt enemies on that basis. And for no other reason than they're not our tribe, they're the other. And this isn't new to us. They happen, and Jesus was addressing it to his first century audience, where Jews had their natural enemies, the Gentiles, the Romans, the Samaritans, the religious groups within them had their enemies, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and so forth. The liberals and the conservatives, politically and religiously, they all had the other that they were trained, they were discipled to hate. And our goal this morning isn't to weed out all of those issues, but only to encourage us, to propel us for that not to be our first response. That something else should be our first response. In a world wrecked by hatred, it's natural for us to love us and hate the other. And there are those two groups that seem to be set up in perpetuity. Our neighbors, who are us, and our enemies, who are them. And in Matthew's retelling of the story of Jesus, after Jesus spends some time in Egypt, and then spends some time in a wilderness, he now goes up onto a mountain to give a law. For those Old Testament scholars in here, who does that sound like from the Old Testament? Moses, right? And it's supposed to. When Moses went up on that mountain, he received from God a law that was to shape their community and in part divide them from everybody else. When Jesus went up on the mountain, he didn't receive a law, he was the lawgiver. And he gave the law that was supposed to shape the people who would enter into this kingdom and the ways of those people. So what does this look like in the teaching that we're looking at today? So in Matthew 5:38 says, you have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it too. Give to those who ask, don't turn away from those who would borrow. You have heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. And in Luke's retelling of this sermon, he adds, bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Then in verse 45, in that way you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven, for he gives sunlight to both the evil and the good. He sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. If you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you are kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. In a world wrecked by hatred and animosity, it's natural to love those who are like us and to hate everyone else. We have our neighbors and we have our enemies. And that's life in this world. Except Jesus gives us a new command. And he says in Matthew 5:44, I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who would persecute you. And we're going to start with this second section of his teaching and work our way back into the first. But here he says that in a world wrecked by hatred, it is natural, again, for us to hate or love our neighbor, those who are like us, and hate the other, our enemies. But something supernatural happened when Jesus came. And whether the world recognizes it or not, whether we always recognize it or not, this world is a different place, and a new kingdom has come to find expression here. And he's teaching us what it should look like here. That our love is to be unrestricted like God's. We are to love like God, not like the world. God gives the good sun and the good rain to the just and to the unjust, to the wicked and the righteous. He feeds them all. He clothes them all. He doesn't differentiate there. And what Jesus is saying, our love must be like that. That for followers of Jesus, this means that those two groupings, our enemies and our neighbors, collapse together. We no longer have enemies, we just have neighbors. And on some significant level, we cease the practice as followers of Jesus. We cease the practice of making or recognizing enemies. We only see neighbors. In this new kingdom, this ill will we have toward the other is replaced by an unrestricted, reckless-looking goodwill. Jesus, therefore love. Jesus, therefore love. Say that with me. Jesus, therefore love. Again, Jesus, therefore love. Now, as we move back, after Jesus, here in this teaching, he has obliterated those distinctions between neighbor and enemy. When we move back and to his previous teaching, when we see that he intended far more than just doing good to them even. In Matthew 5:38, he says, "You have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Now, this is repeated throughout the Old Testament. It's in other Near Eastern literature and laws around that time. This law is a law that has provided the foundation for much of our society and their society. It is a law that's meant to restrict violence and injustice. If I knock your tooth out, you can't kill me. Right? That's a good thing. If you lost because of me your shirt, you can't take my coat and my bedding and my house. And so this was a good thing. It restricts violence. It limits injustice. And Jesus says, for you, there's more. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor, the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. When someone shames you, they backhand you across the face, don't return in kind. Don't seek ways that you can shame them back or put them in their place. But take the pain, turn the other cheek, and force them to treat you like an equal, because your honor comes from somewhere else. When someone takes you to court and with everything that the law will allow them to do, they strip all that they can from you, give them the rest, because your security doesn't come from them. Whenever an injustice is done and you're asked to do something that's unjust, like that Roman soldier able to tell that Jewish man to carry his pack for a mile, carry it too. And show him that he's not your enemy, he's your neighbor. And you're not being oppressed, you're serving him. In these ways, not only do you unmask injustice, but you also gain a neighbor. Whenever we look back to the civil rights movement and those images, they had a passion for nonviolence and non-retaliation. Does that mean they did nothing? No, they were very active in what they were doing. But what they did unmasked for the rest of the world the nature of the injustice that was happening, and it communicated to their oppressor that you're not my enemy, you're my neighbor. As radical and impractical and dangerous as this teaching seems, because, we read this and we're like, well, this is going to leave me penniless or dead, right? If I take this seriously. As radical and dangerous and impractical as it seems, this is the strongest ethical theme in the New Testament, one held dear by the earliest church. In Romans 12:14, Paul writes, "Bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them." In 1 Thessalonians 5:15, he writes again, "See that no one pay back evil for evil, but always try to do good to each other and to all people." 1 Peter 3:9, Peter writes, "Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. That is what God has called you to do, and he will grant you his blessing." And the early church in those first 3 centuries took this so seriously that they taught consistently, we will not take vengeance because vengeance is God's. We will not use violence to protect ourselves. We will not aggressively protect our own rights and our own stuff. We will live into this new kingdom that Jesus has brought. We will show the world that it is real, and we will collapse the categories of neighbor and enemy. There are only neighbors for us. Jesus, therefore, love. Period. And as unsettling as that can be for a people like us who have been discipled to despise others, to fight back using the weapons of this world, because of how impractical it seems, many Christians have sought to find some loopholes, right? How can we get out of this, right? Does it really apply here? And so we ask kind of these typical questions. We hear this, Jesus, therefore love. Only neighbors, no enemies. We say, well, what about that person? What about that situation? And our favorite whipping boys in these conversations when it gets real deep is, what about Hitler, right? What about World War II? Or just, what about that jerk at work who bullies me, or at school? What about the invader in my home or in my church? And we ask all of these questions, or maybe we ask, well, what about this or that story in the Old Testament? We can't resolve all those right now, but only say that these questions and these immediate responses are often simply evidence that we have been discipled by this world and not by Jesus. And it makes it where we can't imagine anything other than responding in kind. Our discipleship is showing. And it's a big problem because if we don't respond in the ways that demonstrate the presence and the power of a kingdom that is, the world won't recognize it exists. We can talk about Jesus all day long, but if the world doesn't see us responding like this, in these risky, radical, counterintuitive ways, the world will not know the truth that this kingdom that he brought exists. It's real. And the question in every situation in which we may view someone else as the enemy or the other isn't, how can I get out of this? All right, what's the loophole here in the Sermon on the Mount or in the rest of the Bible that gets me out of viewing them as my neighbor? It's what kind of response in this moment will demonstrate the presence and the power of the kingdom that Jesus brought to an enemy that doesn't know it exists yet. If we accept the Bible as a story that leads ultimately to Jesus, which we should, if we accept that Jesus did indeed bring his kingdom, it'll come into full fruition at some later point, but it is here. It is real. We should accept now that what Jesus has brought here in this teaching supersedes Moses and all that goes before it in human history, all the storylines that lead to us responding in kind to enemies. All of it's done away with. The storyline leads to Jesus. And we just need to be faithful. Those discipled in the way of Jesus demonstrate unrestricted love to all. They don't have enemies, they have neighbors. And this discipleship, it takes time. It takes work, community work in a community like this to imagine what could be if we lived into this. Those Amish girls in that Amish community, they didn't wake up that morning suddenly feeling like they shouldn't retaliate against their enemy or they should love their oppressor. That's not how that worked. They had been trained all their lives in the way of Jesus, showed how it works itself out in conflict with their siblings and with their peers and with people outside of their community that think they're fools. Those at those lunch counters and on the streets in the civil rights movement, they didn't just wake up that day feeling good about their enemies. They were trained to do that. Some of them grew up in Sermon on the Mount shaped churches, and all of them had to receive intensive training to get that world response out of them so that they could do that. And that's how it's going to work for us. We will become the type of people who are prepared to show the reality of this kingdom in big ways as we learn to do it in small ways. When you and your friends talk about what's wrong with this world and who's making it wrong, taking the time and attention to shift your thinking from them as an enemy to them as a neighbor. Imagine your bully at school. Imagine the coworker. Imagine the Muslim on the other side of the planet. All of these enemies now are your neighbors, and that's it. Jesus, therefore, love. And so our first responses, and this is what we need to begin shaping this morning if you haven't already, our first responses can't be, are they really my neighbor? Did Jesus really mean that? That can't be our first response. Our first response has to be, what would it look like for me to treat them like my neighbor this week? Our first response should be shaped by these teachings so that we can do it in the little things. So when those big things come, it's just instinct. We identify our enemy now as our neighbor, and we consider, what does treating him like a neighbor, not an enemy, look like today? Not how can I gain the power necessary to stop them, but how can I serve them today? Jesus, therefore, love. Not enemy, neighbor. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for how the kingdom that you brought, that even while we were your enemies, you went to the cross for us. And people will die for their friends, but who dies for an enemy, Paul says. And that's what you did. And I pray that our lives will be shaped from top to bottom by this recognition that the kingdom that you brought eliminates enemies and turns them into neighbors. And that the only response, our first response, has to be love. Amen.